everyone. Welcome to City Futures Research Center seminar series. I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional land of the Bidjigal people of the Euro Nation, and I'd like to pay my respect to the elders, past and present, as well as to any First Nation people joining us today. If you're joining online, please mute your microphone and turn off your camera during the presentation. Once we get to Q&A, you're welcome to turn your cameras back on and unmute yourself. You can also put a question in the chat and we will be monitoring the chat for questions. Now I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Fatima Aminpour, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Parian. So today our presenter is Anna Mortimer. She's a lecturer in sociology and social justice at the University of Notre Dame and a research assistant for the City Futures Research Center, who just joined us there recently. She has recently submitted her PhD at the University of Newcastle, and her PhD project examined the displacement crisis following the Eastern Australian floods. Her research centers on issues related to internal displacement, disaster homelessness, and emergency housing in Australia. She's interested in exploring long-term impacts of this issue, and she advocates for disaster management reform to ensure that the human rights of displaced population are protected. So now I'm handing it over to Anna.
Great. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today, and thank you for joining to listen to my presentation that's based off my PhD research. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that I'm meeting you here today on the lands of the Awabakal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So today I'm going to focus on the topic of internal displacement and specifically the case study of the Eastern Australian floods, which impacted the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales in 2022 across 2 consecutive flood events. I think I'm able to navigate the slides. Yes, I think that works. Okay. So before focusing on the case of these floods and the displacement that occurred, I just want to provide context for the concepts that I'll be using today. So these are all on the screen, but just to summarise, my study is concerned with the issue of internal displacement stemming from disasters. And this phenomena occurs when people are forced to leave their homes or places of residence due to the foreseeable impacts or post-disaster impacts of a disaster, and when they have not crossed an international border. So displacement is often characterised in terms of a trigger event, such as a disaster or a conflict, or the duration of occurrence. And my research focuses on prolonged or protracted displacement, which is when people are displaced and feel that they cannot envision or anticipate an end date to their displacement. And they often self-describe as being existing in a state of limbo, or that they have no options or hope for their future. Human mobility scholarship broadly encompasses a variety of different types of displacement, including planned relocations, migration, or voluntary movements. However, much of the existing research is focused on dislocation caused by conflicts and violence or development, with an overwhelming emphasis on the experiences of refugees who cross international borders. In comparison, there's been very limited scholarly or governmental research into the phenomena of internal displacement, except for the case of international monitoring organisations such as the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, which does produce data on the instances of displacement. But what's missing is that qualitative, more in-depth data in terms of the phenomena of internal displacement, how it's experienced, how long people are displaced for, and also their trajectory from displacement to recovery, which is generally unknown. And this is especially unknown in the context of high-income nations such as Australia. Obviously, there's, anomalies to that, such as the experiences of Hurricane Katrina, etc. But the majority of research isn't focused on a variety of contexts. So what I'm trying to highlight is that there's these nuances between different locations, durations, and experiences, and we need to look at displacement in the context of each nation, particularly because different national contexts have different drivers for displacement risk and also outcomes for displacement. So before focusing on the Eastern Australian floods, I also want to provide context for why the issue of displacement is needed to be examined further in the age of climate change, which demonstrates how and why this is an under-researched area that needs further governmental and scholarly attention. So firstly, just to highlight some data, in 2023, natural hazards displaced around 7.7 million people globally, and in 2022, it was 8.7 million people displaced by disasters. So this is a growing complex problem that occurs in part due to the rising rates of natural hazards caused by anthropogenic climate change. Data from the IPCC demonstrates that climate change is fueling the frequency, severity, and unpredictability of environmental hazards, leading to a rise in disasters. And when this is mixed with the intersecting social and developmental challenges of population growth in hazard-prone areas, general environmental degradation, weak governance systems, and other social issues such as poverty or economic insecurity, it actually amplifies the vulnerability of people and exposure of their property to disasters, and subsequently raises displacement risk. And these compounding social and political and environmental issues are resulting in more instances of human displacement globally. And this is predicted to worsen as a result of climate change. It's difficult to estimate, the likelihood or rates of when this will occur or how many people globally, but different monitoring centres such as the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre and Global Protection Cluster do provide country-based predictions of displacement occurrences and the likelihood of how climate change will impact them. I'm going to focus now specifically on Australia. So we know that in Australia, the intensifying rate of natural hazards due to global warming is increasing. We've seen it anecdotally, I'm sure, across recent years, and the continuous disaster declarations we've seen across 2019 until recently. It's predicted that by 2050, an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 people will be displaced annually due to sudden onset disasters due to these rising figures in natural hazards. And the real impact is even greater when we also account for rising inequality in this country. So think about issues with housing insecurity, economic insecurity, the decline of the middle class, and also rolling back of different services and continued population growth. It's likely that this number will be worse if we don't account for these intersecting challenges. And so Australia's increasing vulnerability to displacement is due in part to our history of devastating natural hazards, including bushfires, floods, and cyclones. Climate change will amplify these risks and leading to more frequent and severe hazards and more rates of displacement in this country. And although most of the displacement research has focused on developing nations, high-income nations such as Australia are not immune from these dangers. Obviously, the focus is relevant and necessary given that majority of people who will be impacted by displacement are coming from the context of low-income nations. However, climate change is going to increase issues across the globe, meaning that we still do need to investigate these challenges locally, not just internationally, especially because we need to understand how to better prepare our populations for these issues. And this underscores the urgent need for more research on displacement within Australia. We need to understand both the short-term and long-term impacts of climate-induced displacement and develop proactive strategies to reduce the vulnerability of at-risk communities. And by examining displacement in the Australian context, we can also contribute to the broader understanding of how displacement varies across different geographical, social, and economic, cultural contexts. So in light of these gaps, my thesis sought to address significant theoretical and empirical gaps in disaster studies and displacement research by focusing on the case of prolonged displacement following the Eastern Australian floods. As demonstrated on the slide, which shows my question, aims and objectives, my thesis took a step-by-step approach to examining internal displacement in Australia. Specifically, it looked at how displacement was accounted for in current disaster and emergency governance frameworks to see if policy and governance recognised disaster displacement or was planning for its impacts. It also explored the drivers of displacement, the lived experiences of those who are displaced, and service gaps that were found to exist in response to the Eastern Australian floods. So in my research, I applied an exploratory multi-method qualitative case study approach to address these 4 key questions. And the approach was grounded in the theoretical framework of the vulnerability paradigm of disaster studies. According to this perspective, disasters are not simply a natural event, but rather the result of multiple intersecting social, economic, political factors that that fuel disaster risk and therefore displacement. And this helped me to shed light on the different complexities of displacement in this context, to highlight that it's more than just environmental triggers that are causing displacement, that it's a part of this broader structure of social, economic, and environmental vulnerability. I should say the data set that I looked at was policy documents and frameworks. It was interviews with 18 displaced people who were displaced up to 9 months after the floods. And also I analysed the independent flood inquiry submissions and found 108 submissions from people that acknowledged that they were from the Northern Rivers and were experiencing displacement. So that's the data I analysed for this research. Now I just want to focus briefly on the case of the Eastern Australian floods, just in case anyone's not familiar with that event. So in the early hours of February 28th, 2022, the Wilson River in Lismore breached its levee, causing unprecedented flooding. And by the morning, many had taken refuge on their rooftops as floodwaters peaked at a record 14.37 metres. And within 24 hours, downstream communities in the Richmond Valley and Ballina LGAs also experienced flooding. And the broader Northern Rivers region, including the Clarence Valley and Byron Shire, were also impacted. Now, because of the impacts of this flood, with issues with groundwater retention and floodwater remaining, high rainfall also led to a second flood event on March 29th, which compounded the impact, leading to further evacuations across multiple LGAs in the Northern Rivers. And that's just an image on the map. The map there is just an image of those regions. And these catastrophic flood events make up the basis of the environmental event that I'm looking at in the case of prolonged displacement. So these floods caused significant post-disaster impacts on communities, especially regarding housing loss and damage, which led to widespread displacement. It's also considered the worst flood in Australia based off economic impact as well. So I can't give an exact detail of how many houses were damaged or destroyed because the numbers have varied, but I'm just going to draw from the Independent Flood Inquiry report, which suggests that over 25,000 people in New South Wales were evacuated and more than 4,000 homes were deemed uninhabitable, and around 10,500 homes were damaged, which left many in need of emergency accommodation. So while we don't know the exact number of people who remain displaced, we know that mass displacement has occurred and that the lack of post-disaster housing options have left many people experiencing prolonged homelessness. And this issue of displacement was compounded by the pre-existing housing insecurity issues in the region, which limited the availability of housing stock after this disaster. And obviously, this was already a crisis in the region. Housing was a crisis. And so this just worsened the pre-existing housing crisis, where we had a new influx of homeless populations, who were unable to access services. So the government did develop emergency housing people into hotels and other temporary accommodations. But in the 8 to 9 months following the floods, there were still few interim housing options for those who were displaced. Many were awaiting insurance payouts for rebuilding their homes, and many people had no other options but to live in flood-impacted dwellings that were not habitable because they had basic infrastructure or didn't have the necessary power or plumbing to live in a comfortable dwelling. Also, many could not access emergency housing for a variety of issues. And so this led to prolonged displacement that was exacerbated by these housing issues. So now I'm just going to share my findings for each of my questions. So the first thing I looked at was policy and governance frameworks. Just to highlight as a starting point, the research does highlight that the best way to mitigate displacement from becoming protracted displacement is to have robust policy and legislative frameworks that can mitigate the long-term impacts of displacement and safeguard the rights and needs of affected individuals. This is based off best practice frameworks presented by the United Nations, the Internal Displacement Guidelines, and also research from the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction also supports the need for these policy approaches that can allow for preemptive action to address displacement. So this is needed to address displacement across all phases of the disaster cycle. Obviously a controversial approach, but it's the one that we have in this country, so I'll just talk about it directly. So we need to see displacement recognised across mitigation, preparation, response and recovery. But the recent Eastern Australian floods illustrate the vulnerabilities that arise when displacement is neglected in a preemptive planning approach. So while Australian policies do acknowledge displacement as a potential consequence or outcome of a disaster, current frameworks fail to address essential displacement governance benchmarks that leads to a reactive rather than proactive approach to disaster management. And this undermines efforts to implement anticipatory governance in disaster risk reduction locally. So as demonstrated on this slide, current gaps that exist are the limitations around data collection of occurrences of displacement. So we don't have that historical knowledge of displacement, of how long displacement occurred. We're not monitoring people that have been displaced. And we also have a lack of demographic data on those most affected by displacement and limited longitudinal understandings from people's displacement to their recovery. Our approaches are reactive in the sense that they don't actually plan for large-scale displacement crises, which fails to address displaced people's needs throughout the entire cycle. And current policies acknowledge that housing loss and damage will occur, but the onus of responsibility under our current approaches is placed on the individual. So it's seen that an individual should mitigate their risk through taking out insurance or preparing their homes. But what that fails to account for is these underlying issues of vulnerability that might make that difficult for some people. Also, current policies mainly focus on displacement in the context of immediate response. So when the displacement event occurs, we see efforts being put into evacuation centres and supporting displaced people in that sort of evacuation setting. But there's no preemptive planning for displacement after the closure of centres, meaning that people are left to sort it out by themselves. Obviously, we have strategies like the emergency housing and temporary accommodation, but in the case of the Eastern Australian floods, we saw people inhabiting emergency housing in hotel rooms for periods that far exceeded what could be considered appropriate. So people were still living in these small, overcrowded hotel rooms with their families for months after the floods. And that just demonstrates why we need to have this consistent approach across the entire disaster management cycle. Okay, so on the table is a summarised version of the drivers of prolonged and protracted displacement that I identified in this research. Part of my aim was to highlight why displacement is occurring, what's driving it, and why it's become prolonged or protracted in this case. So one of the foremost drivers that I identified was the environmental vulnerability. So the flooding, it was exacerbated by a legacy of poor urban planning and residential land use planning decisions that saw housing being developed in a flood-prone area. Lismore in particular is an example of that. So it's developed between two major river systems, leading to multiple occurrences of flooding in recent decades. And its geographical location, combined with inadequate floodplain zoning and planning, left many residents exposed and vulnerable to housing loss. And so this just highlights the need for urban planning reform for housing in risky areas. And I know that since this disaster, we have seen conversations emerging, but in focusing on before this disaster, this was currently not happening. So another thing we need to account for is the impacts of climate change. So this flood event was amplified by high rainfall occurring during La Nina years and consecutive La Nina years. And these climatic phenomena, combined with different issues such as the urban planning, made people more susceptible to flooding at this severe scale. Unfortunately, existing policies in place did not adequately account for the worst case flood scenarios if flooding was to occur, meaning that many people's homes were unable to withstand these high record floodwater experiences that occurred in February 2022. And this will likely worsen as a result of climate change as well, in terms of higher flood levels and the urban planning issues, meaning that people will be vulnerable. So the built environment further compounds these challenges, including access to affordable housing stock in the region. So as noted, there is a pre-existing housing crisis. So after the flood, issues such as access to safe, long-term, affordable housing were difficult. And also people shared with me that they're experiencing before the floods, that some people experienced economic insecurity, which played a pivotal role in what house they decided to buy or to rent, and also meant that in the aftermath of the disasters, many people were further made vulnerable economically. They faced a lot of financial challenges, such as being unable to recover financially from their lost belongings. Many people said that they couldn't afford housing, alternative housing, on top of their mortgages and their rates, meaning that they could not afford to pay for an additional home on top of their already existing mortgages. And therefore, a lot of people who were homeowners said that they had no other option but to live in their uninhabitable dwellings. So the institutional responses following the floods have arguably been inadequate, and that's based off the perspectives of those they interviewed and also evidence from the flood inquiry, also the lived experiences from there. Many displaced people shared that they faced bureaucratic hurdles when it came to accessing government recovery initiatives. Many described these initiatives as slow, confusing, and insufficient to meet their long-term needs. And this exacerbated feelings of uncertainty and anxiety for the people that were experiencing prolonged displacement who I interviewed. So these experiences of displaced people following the 2022 floods highlights that there is an urgent need for disaster management approaches to not only anticipate but actively plan for displacement crises, especially mass displacement crises, in areas that we know are vulnerable to disaster. And we need to also address the underlying environmental, social, and economic and governance factors that contribute to vulnerability both pre and post disaster. That way we can better ensure that we're not seeing protracted or prolonged displacement happening. Displacement is somewhat inevitable in the context of climate change, but we need to make sure that it doesn't extend into the long term, because that's when we see consecutive crises emerge. So now I just want to give some insights from the individuals who experienced displacement, who I spoke to, and whose stories I saw in the data from the Independent Flood Inquiry. So although there's been existing scholarship on disaster displacement, very few studies have delved significantly into the lived experiences of people experiencing protracted or prolonged displacement. Most of the research on lived experience is around those initial few months or event of the disaster itself. So this helps to reveal some of the experiences of those who have been displaced long term. So a significant finding that I identified in my research was the prevalence of mental health issues among displaced populations. Participants who were interviewed and who submitted to the flood inquiry, reported that they had significant mental health decline since becoming displaced. Many disclosed that they had formal diagnoses of depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder, illustrating that they've experienced these profound psychological impacts. However, I just want to reiterate that for a lot of people, it wasn't just the flood event itself that caused these experiences of mental health and wellbeing issues. It was actually the experiences of homelessness and prolonged displacement that was fueling their mental health decline, including the experiences of government services and bureaucracy. There was a lot of people who said that navigating the support services were impactful because people weren't kind, or they felt that people weren't seeing them as an individual. There was also people felt that they're experiencing stigma for being homeless. So all of these things compounded their experiences of mental health decline. Another finding was that there were lots of social consequences for people who are experiencing displacement. So the trauma of being displaced itself destabilised people's sense of safety, security, and notions of home. A finding that I'm writing a paper on now actually was around how some people experienced a detachment from place as a result of their experience. So they started to fear future floods or the impacts of climate change, and caused them to be fearful of their home or community or ever returning, leading to place detachment, which is a significant finding in this area because there's often an assumption that people have an innate connection to place even after a disaster. Many also reported how housing and displacement instability had led to long-lasting repercussions, including not just the mental health decline, but a loss of self-identity. So that made them feel like they didn't have hope for the future. So what emerged in the research was that displacement led to an identity shift. They started to change how they perceived themselves or felt negatively towards themselves as a result of being homeless or experiencing displacement. And the drawn out periods of recovery where they weren't certain about housing or their future led to these further issues where they weren't sure if their life would ever return to normal, which further impacted their overall well-being. So there's quite a few different secondary and tertiary consequences and effects that came from being displaced long-term. I won't go into all of them because obviously I don't have a lot of time, but that was only just the surface. There was a lot more things I found. At the time of the interview, I just wanted to also highlight that many people weren't sure about whether they would get access to housing options. So pods remained on the table in terms of getting access to pod accommodation, but many pods hadn't been developed, or they were still trying to focus on a location for where they could go. Many were still waiting to hear if they would even get access to medium-term housing support. And so that was a huge factor in their uncertainty. What I'm showing here on the slides is a breakdown of the living situations people were in after the floods at the time that I did the interview and at the time they submitted their data to the flood inquiry. So what you can see here is that quite a few people were living with friends and family. Quite a few people were living in their flood impacted homes. When I spoke to people who were living in their homes, as I said, it was difficult. Many had to contend not only with the burden of living in a home that wasn't habitable, but also the burden of feeling like they were trapped in the floodplain or they were trapped in that dwelling because they were waiting on things like insurance payouts or governmental assistance. And what I also found was that many people were experiencing secondary issues related to mould. They expressed how they lived in fear of the mould in their homes, in those dwellings. So arguably, this is linked to inadequate governmental support. Again, this is the perception of people that I interviewed, and I'm going to touch on what some of those things are now. Okay, so focusing on the service gaps, during interviews and also the data I read from the submissions to the independent inquiry, displaced people expressed a deep sense of not having recovered from the disaster. Many felt that they would never recover without substantial governmental interventions, especially around housing, because as I said, the housing market wasn't able to meet their needs, and often people who did have insurance and were living in their flood impacted dwellings were waiting on insurance decisions and also for their payouts. So they were living or existing in what they described as limbo. And this highlights in the research a disconnect between what the perceptions of displaced people were, between what they saw to be the responsibilities of governments to help them as displaced people. So the research revealed significant gaps in what people perceived as support services, and they argue that this was worsening their experiences of displacement and inhibiting them from recovering. So many struggled to access assistance due to arbitrary requirements that where they thought they would meet the criteria, but the goalposts for the criteria consistently changed, or because they didn't have the right form or they made a mistake on the form that set their process back. This was also a part of that bureaucratic stress that I mentioned. So these difficulties navigating this system, accessing different services, put them at risk of not being able to properly recover, in their opinion. So homeowners with insurance are typically not seen as a group that's vulnerable to displacement long term, and that's because they have assets. So vulnerability literature doesn't actively acknowledge this group as being vulnerable to displacement long term, but what we saw in this case is that the indefinite delays on insurance claims left many in a state of uncertainty and unable to rebuild or move away from the floodplain without their claim being processed. So they were trapped in the floodplain. Another issue was that government housing recovery programs were often inaccessible to those who were waiting for insurance claims. And because of the delays in insurance that have been noted from the insurance industry themselves, many people missed out on government grants if they didn't get their claim approved. So you can see how this exacerbated the inequality of homeowners who had insurance. Many explained that this process, as in homeowners, many homeowners explained that these issues pushed them into financial insecurity, with some forced to pay for their mortgages while living in an uninhabitable dwelling and not being able to afford alternative housing. Many explained that they were living in what they described as poverty. So this disconnect was a major barrier for many people's recovery and made people feel abandoned by the government in these situations. So that was a major thing that I found. However, many people also were very happy to talk about solutions that they saw to ending these issues or to protecting future displaced populations. They gave feedback about how the system could be made better from other people. There was almost like an acknowledgement that they were impacted, but they wanted these things to be better for the future. So one of the things that they said was that they would like to see government services being more trauma-informed, ensuring that there was a caseworker approach where if they had to access services that they could talk to the same people who understood them and their story. And also there needed to be more communication and support around accessing these grants for traumatized people. But ultimately, what this research highlights is the connection between the vulnerability research paradigm, which suggests that governance or governmental support processes after a crisis can either exacerbate or alleviate people's experiences of prolonged displacement. So in this case, people's ability to recover was potentially impacted by the limited preemptive planning and the constant changes in accessibility requirements and also lack of what they perceive to be support from these services. But it demonstrates that there is an urgent need for governmental programs and governmental policy to address some of these issues that might be exacerbating the issues and leading to prolonged and protracted displacement. So based off this data, I developed a conceptual framework for the role of governance in causing or contributing to protracted displacement in this case. So arguably protracted displacement following these floods is largely a result of poor planning before the disaster and inadequate or ineffective governance approaches to address housing recovery needs that ultimately trapped people in uninhabitable homes or left them with few options for housing recovery. Arguably, this created a cycle of disaster-induced poverty for some people that they found difficult to escape or to rebuild their lives. And arguably, this is a worsening problem under climate change, and so we need to address these issues to protect people in the future. This research shows how governance, particularly through flawed housing policies and disaster recovery initiatives, drives prolonged and protracted displacement. This has been looked at in past disasters, as in the role of governance. However, it hasn't effectively been looked at in the context of Australia or other high-income nations. And so just highlighting some of these broader governance factors, these include things like neoliberal housing policies and the financialisation of housing mixed with our neoliberal approach to disaster resilience that place the burden of responsibility on individuals. These factors are contributing to issues around recovery that have not been accounted for to date. And while much of this research, again, on governance does focus on displacement in conflict zones, there is a gap of understanding how this can drive protracted displacement in these contexts. So my research has attempted to highlight some of these gaps to make a clearer picture about the things that are driving protracted displacement. And I should mention this is obviously not the only factor. As I mentioned, vulnerability, there's multiple factors that contribute to vulnerability and disaster risk, but just because of the limited time, I wanted to focus on this particular factor. So my argument is that as climate change does intensify, governments need to reevaluate disaster recovery policies, both pre and post-disaster, so that they can ensure that they can support displaced people who are going to be displaced both in the short and long term, so that we can prevent protracted displacement from occurring. And I also just wanted to highlight some of the areas for further research that I've suggested. My study was an exploratory study. I couldn't address everything, obviously. So part of the thing I did was make a detailed assessment of what research we need to get a clearer picture of disaster displacement and to support the needs and rights of those who are displaced. So here's some suggestions. Any researchers out there who are interested, this is a very big need. So we need to understand the connections between pre-disaster social vulnerability factors and whether that is a determinant for post-disaster protracted displacement. Because I obviously didn't have a representative sample of all people that were displaced, I could not account for this in my research, but further research is needed in this area to understand that particular driver. We also need a displacement risk index. So this would be fantastic if we could account for and identify regions in Australia who are most at risk to prolonged displacement, including considerations of natural hazard exposure and risk, and also community demographics and housing quality in those regions, so that we could target intervention for the most vulnerable and at-risk communities to ensure that we can protect them from protracted and prolonged displacement. Also looking at climate-induced displacement and place attachment. I'm doing a study on this at the moment, on the impacts of this, looking at how emotional ties can be shifted or changed as a result of trauma from disasters and also anticipatory loss. But I would love someone to do a study on the health impacts of living with mould, specifically because this was one of the most major concerns of those that I interviewed who were living in their flood-impacted dwellings, who expressed that they had developed respiratory illnesses as a result. I'm not in the health field, so any health people out there, this is a really interesting area that needs further exploration. And also there's a need for further research on how displacement affects different groups in this country. So focusing on the experiences of renters, of First Nations people, and individuals with disabilities or those in rural populations would help to develop a complete understanding of people impacted across a diverse range of demographics. Thank you, everyone. This is my contact details if you want to reach out. And does anyone have any questions?
Thanks, Anna. We have Hal's making comments actually. So I'm just going to read this aloud. As some others on the call might know, under the UK's statutory homeless framework, persons made homeless due to fire or flood are the housing responsibility of the relevant local authority. So the local authority must take care of their accommodation needs, potentially including provision of long-term rental housing. Coping with the rehousing needs arising from a flood on the scale of Lismore would be a huge stretch for any local authority. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that, Anna?
Yeah, it definitely would be a huge task. There were so many people that were displaced in Lismore. In terms of trying to address all of their needs, that's obviously a big challenge. It's great that other areas around in the world are doing things like this. I'm not really sure how to address that though, but that's definitely something that I should look at. So thank you for sharing that one. I should mention there is obviously the housing buyback scheme and the different house retrofit schemes that are happening from the federal and state government at the moment. There's funding being delivered. There's been lots of issues or feelings that it hasn't addressed the need of certain populations. That was not my research focus, but definitely something that should be investigated since different approaches have been put in place by state and federal governments.
There is a question from Hal here. I would imagine that the often long duration of this displacee statue may have led to many people having to move through a sequence of temporary accommodations that would surely compound this dislocating impact of the whole nightmare experience. What did your research reveal on this?
Yes, so that is a great point. I didn't go into this in a great deal of detail, but many of my participants had navigated the emergency housing or temporary housing schemes where they were placed in motel rooms or other temporary accommodations such as hostels or camps for essentially a few days to weeks at a time. It's similar, I guess, to the emergency housing approaches that are taken to address homelessness. What displaced people found, however, was that navigating these continuous shifts in accommodation where they needed to move every couple of days was incredibly difficult for them and their emotional well-being, and also the trauma experienced by themselves and their children. They reported that children specifically had a lot of difficulties with this, not feeling settled and feeling afraid. There was a lot of discussion around how they constantly feared that they would be sleeping rough or on the streets or having to go back to their flood-impacted homes because there wouldn't be any accommodation available. What was suggested was that, and this wasn't across the board, again, I think it depends on the person you talk to in these services, that with the level of care or assistance you receive, which is one of the unfortunate impacts. But some people, and there was a theme across this being something that did happen for them, was that if they called up accommodation, and often it ran out on a Friday and no one answered their call, they were homeless for 2 to 3 days until the services opened up again. That left a lot of people in a lot of distress. Also, there was conversations from, obviously this is perception or the perspectives of those involved, that it depended on if someone believed your story was worthy enough of support. So the person you got at the other end of the phone, they got to determine that if you got to have accommodation or not. Some people explained how a way they got around this was that they just hang up and call back, and if they got a nice person, they'd get accommodation. But in some cases, people were having to sleep rough if they couldn't get service support. Another thing was the issue was that they might have got accommodation up to 4 hours drive away from where they were. That was really difficult for people trying to maintain work in their communities where they were displaced. One of my participants said that she couldn't stay in that accommodation because it was 4 hours away and she couldn't leave her kids to drive that distance to go to work each day, so that she just didn't take the accommodation. And because she didn't take up that accommodation 4 hours away, she was kicked out of the program and banned from ever accessing it again, leading to her having to be living in her car with her 2 children. So these are some complexities that was found around this temporary accommodation, and the, I guess, trauma that came from the bureaucratic processes of navigating these systems as well.
So there is a limitation on the number of accommodations, temporary accommodations that can accept the person who is being offered that kind of accommodation. Otherwise, they are being kicked out of that program. Is that correct?
Yeah, from what I was told by my participants, yes. I'm not sure if that is for everyone. As I said, I think it was a case-by-case basis, and who you got to speak to that determined that.
Okay, there is another question from Hal. Comparing the impact of flooded homes on different housing tenure groups, if one can generalize on this, might the impact have been worse for low-income, uninsured homeowners more than for renters?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I really struggled to actually interview many renters for my study, because those that I did approach felt that they didn't want to talk out about it because they were trying to access government programs and didn't want that to impact them. So they had a lot of fear about talking to me. So most of the people I spoke to were people that were homeowners, which is a gap in my research. I would have liked to have been able to talk to a diverse range of people who had different housing tenure types. I don't want to generalize and say the experience was worse or not, because obviously I don't have the data on that. But what I will say is that at least the approaches to addressing displacement for homeowners who were low income homeowners who had issues, that was a lot more difficult for them to access services. So that was a limitation, is that they weren't really accounted for as a potential disaster impacted group that would need additional support. And most of the provisions, from what I can gather, were given to people who were renters or who were uninsured. So it's difficult to sort of say because I didn't get a chance to speak to many.
Okay, there is another question. In your research, did you find any positive relocation where people were able to move and experience a good recovery of mental health and well-being?
So I think because when I look at the time I collected data, it was 9 months after they've experienced this. I think still very much they were in the throes of recovery. One person I did speak to just found out that they were going to get a pod or get access to a pod, and another person had just moved into a pod when I spoke to them. Their perceptions of things were drastically different to anyone else I'd spoken to who had yet to hear about a pod who had been declined support in that way. So they experienced, I guess, positive beliefs about these programs. They said that it's never going to fully allow them to recover until they find permanent housing. But just having that access to temporary housing supported by the government meant that they could breathe and they could focus on their mental health. So they said that they weren't recovered yet, but it was the starting point towards their recovery. Although I should say everyone said that they don't anticipate they would ever fully recover from this. And I guess recovery is dependent on the person's belief of what that looks like. Some people said that was because of the trauma. Some people said it's because of all the loss they'd experienced, the change in community demographics, or their fears of the future. So it was dependent, but definitely, I guess, the two people who were going to access those services and who did have access were on the road to recovery, and they felt positive about being involved in these PODS programs.
Great. Is there any other questions from the audience? Okay, I'm handing it over to Parian to close the session and introduce our presenters for the next seminar. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fatima, and thanks, Anna, for your fantastic presentation. Just as a reminder that our next seminar will be held in 2 weeks. City Futures Deputy Director Hazel Isho will co-present with our Senior Research Fellow Edgar Leo on facilitating social cohesion on rapidly densifying neighborhoods. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and I wish everyone a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.